one of the most tantalizing possibilities is that the megaliths were built by giants. And I think that there's some truth to that. Certainly, if you talk to the Quechua people in Peru, and you ask them, who built the megaliths? Who built these massive stone walls, these massive stone foundations that you see in the Andes? Many of them will say the giants built them. They were built by giants. I think that the megaliths in Sardinia were built by the descendants of the Nephilim, by the various tribes of giants that were inhabiting the Levant, and very likely the island of Sardinia and other areas of the Mediterranean, in a post-flood context. In other words, after the aqueous cataclysm described in the biblical text, these were the giants inhabiting the world after the flood of Noah. That one. This is Timothy Alberino, and let me say it again. This is Timothy Alberino, and you guys are watching End Times Productions. In Cusco, there's a legend of a vast underground network of tunnels. These tunnels are rumored not only to run under Cusco, but under the Andes in general, for hundreds and perhaps even thousands of miles. This is known as the Chinkana. And Chinkana is a Quechua word that means the place where one gets lost. It's a labyrinth. So the Chinkana is a labyrinth. Some of the labyrinth, according to legend, is naturally occurring. In other words, it makes use of lava chambers and tunnels and natural caverns. Some of it is artificial, meaning that the tunnel was dug out and is in some cases lined with stone. There's a particular corridor of the Chinkana that is 100% artificial. It runs from beneath the Coricancha to the galleries beneath the megalithic complex of Sacsayhuaman. This corridor is known as the Chinkana Grande, and it's a legend. If you ask archaeologists, well, if you would have asked archaeologists in the past, does the Chinkana Grande exist? They'd say, no, it's a legend, it's just a myth. And the reason why they say it's a legend, and the Chinkana in general, this underground network of tunnels. Now, they'll acknowledge that there are some tunnels under Cusco. Archaeologists know this, historians know this, because the Spaniards made use of them to some degree. You can still see the entrance to some of these tunnels in the churches, specifically in the Jesuit church in the plaza in Cusco. If you go into the Jesuit church, go down to the basement, you'll see there's a hole in the ground, and you can see there's tunnels beneath the church. So that's not, that part of the Chinkana is not the legend. The legend refers to the conquest of Peru when Francisco Pizarro and his 170 some odd conquistadors were making their way from Cajamarca to the city of Cusco after capturing and killing the Sapa Inca, the Inca emperor Atahualpa. They were obviously looking for gold. They knew that there was a lot of gold in the capital city of Cusco, and the Inca priests knew that the Spaniards were coming for their gold and for their artifacts. So what they did was they took all of the artifacts, their most sacred artifacts, their most important artifacts made of gold and silver and other kinds of precious stones and precious metals, and they secreted them away into the Chinkana Grande. And the Chinkana Grande, as I said, is located, one of the entrances is located, the principal entrance is located beneath the Coricancha. The Coricancha was the center of the Inca Empire. It was the most important, it was the center of their religion, but it was the center of the empire. It was the heart of the empire. It was the most important temple of the Inca. And Coricancha in Quechua means the place of gold, because the Coricancha, the walls of the Coricancha were lined with plates of gold. And inside of the Coricancha, even to this day, you can see the andesite walls, very finely worked andesite walls each one of those little temples inside of the Coricancha, there were these miniature temples, and each temple was a temple dedicated to different cosmological phenomena. One was the temple of the sun, there was a temple of the moon, there was a temple of the rainbow, and so forth. And they, in each of these temples, they would have the mummified remains of a previous emperor. And at certain times of the year, specifically during the winter solstice, during a festival known as Inti Raymi, they would take these mummies out of the temple, out of the Coricancha, and they would parade them through the streets as if they were still alive. So they would put them on what are they called, pyres, what they carry through the streets on their shoulders, and they would celebrate these dead emperors again as if they were still alive, and then they would put them back in the Coricancha. So the Coricancha was very, very important to the Inca. And in the Coricancha, on the premises of the Coricancha, there was a garden that had life-size depictions of animals, people, of plants, and everything in the garden was cast in either pure gold or pure silver. So it was obviously, when the Spaniards heard about this, it was very enticing. And they were marching to Cusco to capture the city. The capital city of the Inca Empire was Cusco, but also specifically to capture the gold, to capture the treasure, the gold and silver of the Inca. And so the priests, in order to save their most sacred artifacts, they took all of these artifacts down into the tunnel. And the tunnel runs for 1 mile from beneath the Coricancha to beneath the megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman, the galleries beneath those walls. And they took all of these artifacts through the tunnel and deposited them somewhere beneath Sacsayhuaman. And this, again, is a legend. This is a legend, and archaeologists and historians have always considered it a legend. It's not true. The tunnel doesn't exist. Well, the tunnel does exist. We have proof that the tunnel exists. Back in 2019, I was in Peru working on a project with my colleague Anselm P. Rambla and my partner Gary Haven. We were making a film series called Chasing Legends, which today you can see in my members community for those who are interested in watching that film series. But we, while in Peru, we went to Cusco, and we have a state-of-the-art GPR unit that operates off of a drone platform. And we have the capability with this unit, it's Russian technology. We have the capability to see, with one of the antennas, we can see, it's a deep penetrating antenna, we can see 300 feet below the surface of the earth. The other antenna is a shallow penetrating antenna, but higher resolution. We can see about 15 feet, but we can see very high resolution. And we took our GPR unit while we were in Cusco, and we put it into a duffel bag because we didn't have permission to fly our drone or to use this technology, but we had it with us. So we put the unit in the duffel bag, and our guys carried it around the premises of the Coricancha, and we detected the tunnel, and we were able to image it in 3D. We know where the tunnel begins. And Anselm acquired another unit, the same as ours, and did the same thing. And he verified our find, and he even got a better, higher resolution scan than we did, and he was able to map a whole portion of the tunnel. Now, Anselm P. Rambla has history. Anselm has actually excavated at Sacsayhuaman. And Sacsayhuaman is one of the most impressive megalithic sites on planet Earth. And you don't just get permission to excavate at Sacsayhuaman. So Anselm was able somehow to get permission to excavate there. And he excavated in several areas. And by the way, as a side note, Anselm discovered proof, irrefutable proof, that the walls of Sacsayhuaman were not built by the Inca, and by extension, the rest of the megaliths in Peru. He found at the lowest levels, at the base levels of the wall, he found pre-Inca artifacts, and only pre-Inca artifacts. There were no Inca artifacts at the base of the wall. which indicates that the Inca discovered the walls of Sacsayhuaman, the megalithic site, and decided to rebuild and to refortify it and use it for their own purposes. But Anselm, while he was excavating, and this was years ago, he had his excavations going at Sacsayhuaman, he heard of the legend of the Chinkana. And he decided to go investigate. So here he's over at Sacsayhuaman with his team excavating, and he hears about the Chinkana and diverts himself and a couple of his team members to go over and investigate at the Coricancha. Well, the Coricancha is today occupied by the Dominican order of the Catholic Church. They built a cathedral and a convent over the ruins of the Coricancha, of the Inca temple. And it is called the Convent and Cathedral of Santo Domingo, Saint Dominic. It's the Dominican order. And they were seated, the Coricancha, a long time ago after the conquest, sometime in the 1500s. So the Dominican order has occupied this site for many, many years, hundreds of years. So he went down to Santo Domingo, and he was able to talk with the prior, the head priest of the cathedral. So he asked the prior if the rumors were true, if the legends were true, if in fact, beneath the Coricancha and beneath the church, beneath the cathedral, which is built on top of the Coricancha today, if in fact there is an artificial tunnel, if in fact the Chinkana exists, is it real? And to his utter surprise, the prior said to him, "Yes, the legend is real. Would you like to see the tunnel?" And Anselm was flabbergasted by this proposition. And of course, he accepted. And so the prior took Anselm and a couple of his guys into the cathedral, into the main sanctuary in the cathedral. And he had them help him move an altar out of the way. So they slid this altar out of the way, and under the altar was a trap door. And they opened up the trap door, and it led down into a crypt beneath the church. So they descended into the crypt, and they're standing there in the crypt, and they have their flashlights. As they're standing in the crypt, they notice that there is a wall that's out of place. It doesn't look like the rest of the walls of the crypt. It's made of red bricks, and it's covering something up, and it's not entirely complete. There's like a gap. And Anselm asked the prior, who's down in the crypt with them, "What's this? Where does this go?" And the prior said, "That is the entrance to the Chinkana." And so Anselm walked over to it. He took his flashlight. He had a very high-powered flashlight. And he pointed his flashlight into the tunnel. So this brick wall was blocking off a tunnel, but there was some gaps in the bricks, and pointing his flashlight in the tunnel. And he could see, first of all, that the tunnel went on for a very long way. His flashlight, the light didn't get to the end. And he noticed that the tunnel was artificial. It was lined with the same andesite blocks as the temples in the Coricancha above. And it was shaped like the trapezoidal doorways as in the Coricancha above. Remember, they're basically in the lower levels, the bowels of the Coricancha at this point, and in the crypt of the cathedral that was built on top of it. And in the Coricancha, the doorways to the temples are these large trapezoidal doors. And the stonework, by the way, the masonry of the Coricancha is exquisite. It's beautiful. It's andesite, and it's done in the Cyclopean style. There's no mortar that's holding those walls together. And there are some interlocking parts. So it's incorporating the interlocking megalithic style, although the blocks in the Coricancha are not large. They're regular sized blocks, but it's absolutely exquisite stonemasonry. So the tunnel exists, and it's trapezoidal, and it's lined with the andesite blocks, just like in the temple. And it runs for 1 mile. And you have to understand that from the Coricancha to the megalithic complex of Sacsayhuaman, there's an elevation gain of like 1,000 feet or something. But the tunnel isn't going up, the tunnel is going straight. So the further you go, the deeper the tunnel is. So this is the point where the tunnel is most accessible, where it's closest to the surface, where it originates. The further you follow it, the deeper you are under the mountain. And so Anselm, as he's looking at this tunnel with his flashlight, he gets very excited. And he tells the prior, "This is great. I've got a team excavating at Sacsayhuaman right now. We have all the tools and equipment at Sacsayhuaman. We can bring the team and the equipment here. We can take this brick wall down and go into the Chinkana and investigate and explore it." And the priest, Anselm told me that the priest in this moment, his countenance completely changed. He was very accommodating in the beginning, but suddenly, on a dime, he became extremely hostile. And he began to shout at Anselm, and he said, "No, absolutely not. No way. I should not have shown this to you. I made a mistake. I should not have shown this to you." And then he said, "Get out. Get out of here. You're not going to come back. I made a mistake. Get out of here." And he threw Anselm and his guys out of the church. He turned on a dime. And Anselm realized later, talking to a later prior, years later, that the priors were keeping the secret of the Chinkana. It was handed down from prior to prior. And the prior is the head priest at the convent, at the cathedral. He's the guy in charge, right? And this secret of the Chinkana was passed down through the centuries, from prior to prior. The regular priests really didn't know about it. They knew about the legend, but only the priors knew about the Chinkana. So he realized this priest, this prior, that he had made a mistake. He wasn't supposed to reveal this. For whatever reason, he did. Anselm believes that it was destiny, and that it wasn't time yet to go into the Chinkana, but that time would come. Okay, well, so Anselm, obviously, he's seen the Chinkana. And he realizes that if he can get down into the Chinkana, it would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in centuries, not just in Peru, anywhere. Because again, according to legend, the most important artifacts of the Inca and probably pre-Inca cultures were secreted away beneath the megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman. And Anselm believes that the revelation of the builders of Sacsayhuaman, in other words, the identity of the builders of the megaliths in Peru, is concealed under Sacsayhuaman in the galleries. There's artifacts or some kind of maybe hieroglyphs, something down there that will reveal to the world who built the megaliths in Peru. And other things as well, other things besides. This is what Anselm believes. And I don't doubt it. I personally think there may be some truth to that. Now, unquestionably, I believe that the artifacts were secreted away, that there are revelations about the Inca Empire and about the pre-Inca cultures and about the history of Peru that would demand a rewriting of elements of history in regard to Peru, aspects of the history and the conquest of Peru and all of that. However, I'm not sure how much of that is still there, because the Dominicans have had centuries. They've had access to this tunnel, to the labyrinth beneath Cusco, and specifically the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman for centuries. And it's difficult for me to believe that, having had the knowledge of the tunnel, that they would not have explored it and ransacked the treasures, if there were any to begin with in the galleries. So I don't know what would be left to this day. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it was too dangerous. Maybe they lacked the resources, the tools to do it properly. Maybe they thought that the tunnels were cursed. Who knows? But we do know that there have been, over the years, there have been individuals, specifically in the early 20th century, who managed to penetrate into the labyrinth, the greater Chinkana, get into those labyrinths, and make their way into the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman. Some of the people who went into the galleries or went into the labyrinth, down into the tunnel system beneath Cusco, died. They died. They never came back out. Others reemerged, but they had lost their minds. They went mad in the tunnels. So the natives believe that the tunnels are protected or cursed to keep people out, and that if you go down into them, you're going to die or you're going to go crazy. In fact, years later, Anselm would return to Peru and miraculously obtain permission to excavate at the Coricancha, to excavate on the premises of the cathedral and convent of Santo Domingo. No one had ever been given permission like this before. It was unprecedented, and the story of how Anselm got permission is in itself wild, but it would be a digression for us today. But Anselm developed a friendship with the prior. It was a new prior. The previous one had either died or was sent somewhere else. And when Anselm went back to Peru to get permission to excavate, there was a new prior in place. And this prior was named Father Gamarra. And Gamarra was a very gentle and good-spirited man. And he was very accommodating to Anselm. And he worked with Anselm so that he could obtain permission to excavate, permission from the Ministry of Culture in Peru. And the prior heard Anselm's story that he had seen the Chinkana and was himself very interested in seeing whether or not the legend was true. Now, I think Anselm found out later that Gamarra knew the legend was true. In fact, Gamarra took Anselm into a back room in the convent one day, and he showed Anselm this artifact, this relic that the Dominicans had in their possession for centuries, or at least for a couple of centuries. And the artifact was a crown, and it was known as the crown of the Virgin and the Child, and it was cast of solid gold. Father Gamarra told Anselm that the crown had been cast from a cob of golden corn that came from the garden of the Coricancha. Remember I said that the garden was full of life-sized animals and plants, and one of the things that we know for sure was in that garden was life-sized corn stalks, and the stalk was made of pure silver, and then the cob, the corn, was made of pure gold. And so Gamarra revealed to Anselm that this crown, which is now a relic in the convent of Santo Domingo, in the cathedral, that the crown had been cast from one of those golden corn cobs from the garden. And furthermore, that the corn cob actually came from the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman. And then he told him the following story. I think this was back in the early 20th century. Could have been in the 1800s. That's why I said the relic is 100 to 200 years old. I don't recall. But it happened that two youths somehow penetrated down into the labyrinth. They found an entrance into the tunnels. And they went down there, and they somehow managed to make their way into the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman. And keep in mind, Sacsayhuaman are the megalithic walls up there in Cusco. One of the most impressive megalithic sites on planet Earth. And as the story goes, related to Anselm by Father Gamarra, one of these young men died in the labyrinth. He died because they got lost, obviously. They got lost. And the other managed to make his way out. Somehow, miraculously managed to make his way out. And the way it happened was Gamarra told Anselm that one day it was recorded by a previous prior, the incident was recorded, that one day the priests heard a knocking. They heard a knocking coming from somewhere in the cathedral. And they didn't know where it was coming from. They were looking all over the cathedral. Where is this strange knocking coming from? And eventually they realized that it was coming from that trap door that I mentioned earlier. And somebody was knocking on the trap door from inside the crypt. And when they opened up the trap door, it was a young man. And they lifted him out of the crypt, and the young man had in his hand this golden corn cob. And he told the prior and the priests who pulled him out of the crypt that he told them the story of how he and his friend had managed to get down into the labyrinth, that they made their way to the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman, and that there they discovered a great treasure. And they had selected just this one piece of corn, this golden corn, from this hoard of treasure to bring back because they couldn't carry anything else, and they were lost. So obviously their primary concern was to get out of there alive. Unfortunately, the other youth, this kid's friend, died in the labyrinth because they were down there for a few days, probably died of dehydration. And this young man had gone mad. He had lost his mind. He was barely coherent, and in fact, he ended up passing away a few days later. But he had given into the hands of the previous prior, one of the previous priors, many years ago, this golden corn cob, which was melted down and forged into the crown of the Virgin and the Child. That was the story. So Anselm had proof, the priors had proof that there was still some treasure beneath Sacsayhuaman in those galleries. Now, whether or not they had gone into the galleries later on, remember, with the advent of modern technology, with the proper gear and flashlights and so forth, maybe they went in and recovered all of that treasure and took it who knows where, maybe to the Vatican, who knows. But there is a possibility that it's still there. And it's not just gold and silver, it's knowledge. That's what you have to understand. There's knowledge in the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman. Anselm believes that once specifically he is able to get into those tunnels, then the secrets of the Andes are going to be revealed. What he calls, actually singular, the secret of the Andes is going to be revealed. And so it's much more than just treasure, it's knowledge. And part of the secret of the Andes is the identity of the megalith builders, because they weren't the Inca. So Anselm gets permission to excavate. Father Gamarra is instrumental in this. And he brings an international team to Peru. I believe this was back in the early 2000s. I can't recall. And he begins these excavations. What is he looking for? He's looking for the Chinkana. Now, he doesn't say that publicly. I think publicly he's saying they're looking for further temples or something like that. There was a cover story. But what he was really looking for was the Chinkana. And he had the advantage of knowing where it was located because he had been down in the crypt. So obviously, as soon as he's given permission, he goes straight for the cathedral to the trap door, right? But the problem is they had, since he was there previously and had opened that trap door of the previous prior, they had retiled the floor of the cathedral. So he couldn't find the trap door. They came in with ground-penetrating radar, and at that time it was inferior to what we have today. It was the kind that you drag across the ground. And he thought it would be very easy to find this trap door, bring in the ground-penetrating radar, relocate the crypt, and then excavate. But it wasn't so easy. They couldn't find the crypt. And it was a prolonged excavation. They couldn't find the crypt. He knew where it should have been, but they couldn't find it. Ultimately, they realized from the data that they were able to collect with the ground-penetrating radar they realized that the crypt was still there, but somebody had filled it in with debris. So either somebody had intentionally filled it in, or there was an earthquake and it had collapsed, but Anselm suspects that it had been deliberately filled in. Like they filled it in so that the Chinkana could not be accessed. And once he realized that, he knew he wasn't going to get in there. He was still going to try, and in fact, he made a very important discovery. They were excavating under the Coricancha, under the cathedral, and they got down to the foundations. And they realized, they have all the evidence of this, photographic evidence and video and so forth. They realized that the foundations of the Coricancha, the most important the temple of the Inca, the religious and political epicenter of the Inca Empire, the foundations were megalithic. And furthermore, they were green diorite, very, very hard stone, very, very hard stone. And most of what you see today in Cusco is not green diorite, but the foundations of all of the important temples are green diorite. So we now know that the earliest foundations of the city of Cusco are megalithic, and they are green diorite. Certainly the foundations of the Coricancha are green diorite, which tells you that the Inca were building on top of some kind of megalithic complex at the Coricancha. The problem is that on top of these green diorite blocks that he discovered, the foundational pillars of the cathedral were anchored on these green diorite blocks. And he realized this is bad, because if we screw around too much here, we could bring the whole cathedral down. Long story short, Anselm and his team were kicked out. The Father Gamara was expelled from the cathedral. He was sent to he was basically sequestered away to like a small village somewhere in the Andes. The head of the Dominican order at the Vatican decided, enough of this, we're bringing this excavation to a halt. And that's when it all ended for Anselm, and he was expelled from the cathedral, from the grounds of the Coricancha, him and his team. And what's interesting is that Anselm's, when he was excavating there, his work was celebrated and by the archaeological community, and also the president of Peru visited him, and the first lady, the Queen of England, the Queen of Spain visited him, and he has pictures of touring the excavations with the Queen of Spain, with the president of Peru at the time. So it was a project that was being lauded by the government and even by the archaeological community until it wasn't, until they decided to get this Spaniard out of there. And I can't remember how it all came to a head. I think it did have something to do with the fact that they were digging too deep and had exposed the foundations of the cathedral and were making too much noise, and the project was taking too much, and the project was taking too long. I can't remember the details, but he was expelled from the premises. So now fast forward to just a few months ago. Anselm's dream and the greatest objective of his life is to get down into the tunnel, is to open the Chinkana and reveal the secret of the Andes. That's his life's mission. And a few months ago, Anselm held a press conference in Barcelona. And Anselm at this point is an older man. I think he's around 74 years old now. But he's still very sharp. And he held this press conference in Barcelona where he revealed the images of the tunnel. And he revealed to the world that the legend of the Chinkana is true, which of course we already knew because we had the proof ourselves from our GPR survey. But Anselm revealed to the world that the legend of the Chinkana is true. Of course, he had seen it with his own eyes, and now he had the GPR data. Well, some archaeologists in and preempted him. And just a couple of weeks later, they announced to the world that they had found the legendary labyrinths beneath the city of Cusco, specifically the Chinkana Grande, and that they were intending to excavate and get into the tunnels. And they stole Anselm's data. They stole his data. So many of you have heard about the tunnels beneath Cusco that have been discovered. That was a few months ago. It was all over the news, international news. Well, understand that that information was stolen from Anselm P. Rambla, and to some degree from us, because we had the data as well, although we had not publicized it like Anselm. I think that a lot of the important megalithic complexes around the world are connected by underground tunnels. I think that goes for Egypt, the megaliths in Egypt, in various parts of Europe, in the Middle East, and certainly in South America. I think that this is the norm. I think there's a lot of hidden structures beneath these megalithic edifices. Certainly Sacsayhuaman, and they could be more megalithic constructions under the ground, or it could be galleries. It could be caverns. It could be all kinds of tunnels that go different places and connect the complexes to other complexes. And in some cases, maybe even hundreds or thousands of miles away. There's something very interesting going on, I think, in the subterranean context of these megalithic sites.
Speculate.
Nobody really knows who built the megaliths. That's one of the grand mysteries. I am aware of, well, let me put it this way. Nobody knows who built the megaliths, but we do know that they were all using the same technique, which is referred to today by archaeologists as Cyclopean masonry. And the Cyclopean style involves large stones, sometimes square or rectangular, sometimes polygonal, that are fitted together so precisely that there's no need for a bonding agent. There's no need for cement or mortar. And this kind of masonry is advanced. It's exceedingly advanced. It's not something that is easily accomplished, especially with stones that weigh sometimes in excess of 100 tons, sometimes in excess of 300 tons. These kinds of Cyclopean megaliths are found all over the earth. And I think what it suggests is that either we're looking at the same builders or we're looking at different cultures who are using the same technology, who had the same knowledge. And it's very ancient. It's much more ancient than the Inca. And I think it's much more ancient than the Egyptians. I think we're looking at a technology, we're looking at knowledge that originates in the antediluvian world. So the question is, who built them? And that's a question that nobody knows. There's people out there who pretend to know, but they don't. Nobody knows. It's a complete mystery. And there are many possibilities. Of course, one of the most tantalizing possibilities is that the megaliths were built by giants. And I think that there's some truth to that. Certainly, if you talk to the Quechua people in Peru and you ask them, who built the megaliths? Who built these massive stone walls, these massive stone foundations that you see in the Andes? Many of them will say the giants built them. They were built by giants. So there may be some truth to that. Certainly wouldn't surprise me. However, that cannot be the only explanation. Even if that's part of the explanation, it cannot be the only explanation. Because some of the megalithic sites around the world and in Peru are not built to the proportions of giants. They're not built proportionally to the stature of gigantic people. The doorways are small. The interiors of some of these megalithic constructions would not accommodate, 9, 10, 11, 12, up to 15-foot giants. They're made for normal. They're made for people of normal stature, common stature. That's apparent when you look at the corridors, the doorways. They're made for people of common stature. However, there are some exceptions, Sacsayhuaman being one of them. If there's one megalithic construction that I've seen more than a few around the world, that I would be willing to concede could have been built for giants, it would be Sacsayhuaman, because the doorways of Sacsayhuaman are very large. They could accommodate 9-foot tall giants. The stairwells are broad, and the stairs themselves seem to be spaced for people with a very long stride.
People are short.
Yeah, the native people were very diminutive. I mean, the Inca themselves were not very tall. I take that back. The nobility of the Inca were tall, but the Andean people who they subjugated were of very short stature. So Sacsayhuaman, in regard to its dimensions, in regard to the doorways themselves and the corridors and the steps, yeah, I mean, those could accommodate people of unusually large stature. But if you are confronted with a megalithic site that has narrow corridors, that has small doorways, then obviously it wasn't built for giants. Maybe built by giants, but not for giants. I have, say this, I've explored many of the megalithic towers in Sardinia, for example, which are known as the nuraghi. And although they incorporate really large stones, they're not as finely dressed as the stones in Peru and other places around the world. They're crude. They're crude megalithic stones, but they're still fitted without mortar. In other words, they're still employing the Cyclopean technique. But these towers, and they're very large towers, many of the towers were over 100 feet tall. Although they incorporate large stones, although they're very tall, the corridors are narrow. The doorways in the corridors are narrow. And me, I'm 6'1", I would have to squeeze into some of these corridors. Certainly they were not broad enough for, even an NBA player. His head would be hitting the ceiling, his shoulders might be scraping up against the walls. So you have to keep that in mind. Granted, the nuraghi towers in Sardinia were probably built in a post-flood context. I don't believe those are antediluvian. I think that the megaliths in Sardinia were built by the descendants of the Nephilim, by the various tribes of giants that were inhabiting the Levant, and very likely the island of Sardinia and other areas of the Mediterranean, in a post-flood context. In other words, after the aqueous cataclysm described in the biblical text. These were the giants inhabiting the world after the flood of Noah. So if they were building these megalithic constructions in Sardinia, they weren't building them for themselves. Because who would build an edifice that was not proportional to their own stature, that was not accommodating to their size? None of us would do that. My sense is that the megalithic edifices were not built as dwellings. They were not built as places of habitation for everyday use. They were ceremonial. Or, probably more likely, they were ceremonial and astronomical or astrological. They were built for some other function. They were not houses. I don't think we should be thinking about megalithic edifices, complexes around the world as dwellings. I think it's much more appropriate to think of them as sacred sites, temples. But when I say temples, I mean places where observations were being made, astronomical observations, places that were used for ritualistic purposes. So it is very possible that these megalithic edifices were constructed perhaps by giants, some of them, but not for giants, not to house giants, not as habitations for giants, but rather as observatories, or as I said before, as ritualistic sites for the practicing of various rituals related to astrology, related perhaps to sorcery, astrology, things like this. When I was in Sardinia some years ago, I was actually accompanied by Anselm, and we were touring one of the large megalithic towers, one of the large Nuraghi towers in Sardinia. And we noticed that on the outskirts of the tower, you have the primary tower, and then all around the tower, you have smaller edifices, these little circular rooms. And archaeologists think that they serve different functions, and I'm sure they did. But one thing that we observed was in some of these rooms, you had a stone, and then on top of the stone, you had a stone basin. So you had like a pedestal and a stone basin. And then around the stone basin, you had an area where people could sit. And I don't recall what the explanations of the archaeologists were for this, but Anselm and I immediately recognized this as an ancient device that was used for making observations, celestial observations. In other words, tracking stars and tracking various celestial phenomena. So what happens is that these basins are filled with water, and the structure would have an opening in the top so that you would have an opening to the sky. And if they're positioned to track a particular star, to mark a particular star, when that star is positioned directly over the basin, there's a flash of light. At the zenith, when that star is directly over the basin, there's a momentary flash of light. And then the astrologer, the astronomer, could make an accurate calculation in regard to the position of the star. And these are used all over the world. They're certainly used in Peru and, in fact, at Machu Picchu. And so when Anselm and I saw these stone basins on these pedestals and these what looked like astronomical observatories, we instantly made this connection between these sites in Sardinia and the ones that are very similar to these in Peru at Machu Picchu. So very clearly, the Nuraghi towers have some sort of an astronomical function related to astrology, related to making accurate calculations about the movement of celestial bodies. And so I presume, therefore, that megaliths in general, probably some of them at least, had this very same function. They were functional edifices. They weren't just citadels. They weren't just, built for defensive purposes, and they weren't just temples in the sense that they were places of worship. Rather, they had a function, and they were built for a very specific reason related to, again, in many cases, astronomy. Yeah, we know ancient cultures all over the world were tracking the precession of the equinox, and were basically keeping the same timepiece, which is the zodiac. We know that. Many ancient cultures around the world. And this was done for many purposes. I mean, for one thing, what they were tracking was cyclic cataclysm. And this knowledge was not proliferated among the masses, among the vulgar. It was only kept by the initiated, by the priest class and the noble class. This was the knowledge that they would be trained in. The young nobles, for example, in Peru, those who were of the royal blood, of the Inca blood, were trained by a class of very mysterious teachers who were called the who were called the Grandes Almautas. And the great Almautas is basically what they were called. And the great Almautas were the keepers of secret knowledge, were the keepers of ancient knowledge that was conveyed, relayed to the Inca nobility. And so that knowledge, I believe, is fragments of knowledge that was preserved from the antediluvian world. I appreciate Graham Hancock and his research. I've read many of his books. He's, first and foremost, he's a very eloquent writer. I really enjoy his prose. And for the most part, I agree with his thesis that there was a highly advanced ancient civilization that once existed on Earth, that for whatever reason, probably due to some cataclysmic event or a series of cataclysmic events, was nearly annihilated, but that there were some survivors. I mean, I generally agree with that thesis, although I believe that a more accurate accounting of that very event, that cataclysmic event, is to be found in the pages of the Bible, and more specifically in the account of the flood of Noah, and then also in the Book of Enoch. And I would say a much more detailed explanation is the one provided in the Enochian text, First Enoch. So let's consider the fact that the Catholic Church, that the Church of Rome, has commandeered the most sacred sites all around the Western world, all of the most important ancient temples and sacred sites. This was a process that was practiced by the Church of Rome called synchronization. And synchronization, basically, what synchronization meant was, if you and I are conquistadors, and with the conquistadors came the priests, and the conquistadors were loyal to either the King of Spain or the King of Portugal, but also to the Pope of Rome. So they had this dual loyalty to their king and country, but also to the Holy See and to the pontiff, to the Pope. And so wherever they went, they were conquering for the king and in the name of God for the Catholic Church, for the Church of Rome, in the name of the Pope. So part of this process was to identify the most important temples and palaces of the cultures in Central and South America, and in fact all over the world, wherever the Church of Rome was dominant, and to, in some cases, demolish those temples and rebuild on top of them, and in almost every case, rebuild a church or cathedral or a convent, or to simply repurpose the temple and modify it, such as is the case in Cusco with Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo, they didn't completely demolish the Coricancha because you still have the ruins of the Coricancha on the premises today. They demolished part of it and they erected the cathedral and convent of Santo Domingo. So this is synchronization. The reason why they do this, it's a show of force. It's like planting your flag on the most important sacred sites of your enemy. But then also it's a way of amalgamating the old religious practices, the old cult practices of the native people into the new established religion that is being established by the conquerors, and that being Catholicism. So where once the natives used to come to this site to worship their various gods, now they come to the site to take Mass, to take communion, and become subjugated to the Church of Rome. That's synchronization. And some of the practices of the various religions of these native people, such as the Inca in Peru, such as the Aztec in Central America, were incorporated into Catholicism into that particular brand of Catholicism. For example, Catholicism in Central and South America has its own brand in comparison to Europe. There's some differences. There are some traditions that you'll find in Central and South America, Catholic traditions, which are distinct from those in Europe, because they're amalgamations of some of the old religious practices of the natives. And this is called synchronization. And synchronization is very useful if you want to quickly convert the native populace to Catholicism. You use the practice of synchronization, you occupy their holy sites, you build your temples on their holy sites, and you synchronize the religion of the Church of Rome, which is Roman Christianity, with the religions of the native populace. Of course, the population is forcibly converted and ultimately has to submit to the catechism of the church, but with some leeway so that they could continue to incorporate some of their traditional practices. So as a result of synchronization, there's many places around the world where you once had pagan temples. Today you have Catholic cathedrals, Catholic churches, Catholic convents, and so forth. Well, what that translates to is a wealth of knowledge and treasure that has been accrued over the centuries by the Catholic Church. Not just treasure, but knowledge. So many of the artifacts that were in the temples fell into the hands of the Roman Catholic Church and probably made their way, if they were important enough, would have made their way to Rome and ended up in the vaults beneath the Vatican. But most of that material would have been destroyed by the priests, such as the codices of the Maya, right? That there are many thousands of Mayan documents, codices, were destroyed by the Catholic Church. So all of that knowledge was just lost in this effort to forcibly convert the population. The same can be said in Peru. Many artifacts were destroyed. If they were of gold and silver, they would have been melted down and melted into bars and then shipped off to Spain. There was something called the royal fifth. A fifth of all the treasure that was discovered by the conquistadors had to go to the crown. So that was always being shipped back across the ocean. The royal fifth was constantly, there was a constant transit of gold and silver and other sort of precious metals and artifacts going over the ocean back to the king of Portugal or the king of Spain. Yeah. So I think that if in the process of, let's say Peru, for example, the conquest of Peru, where the native populations are being incrementally conquered by the Spaniards, as they move through their sacred places, as they move through their temples, they're collecting artifacts. They're collecting knowledge. And that knowledge, and in some cases those artifacts, were probably related to the antediluvian world. And I would say, in some cases, definitely related to the antediluvian world, and specifically to giants. In Peru, there are records, many records, that come out of the chronicles of the conquest of Peru. So in other words, from the very same documents that we derive the history of Peru. Prescott wrote his famous the Conquest of Peru, which is a phenomenal tome. I mean, it's a wonderful read. He derived all of that historical information from the chroniclers, from the chronicles, which are today kept in the library, in a library in Lima, but they've also been digitized, so you can search them, especially if you're a historian, you have access to that library. And I interfaced with a Peruvian historian. His last name was De La Vega, in Puno. I met with this, and he's a very well-known historian. He specializes in history of the Inca, in the Inca Empire. And I sat down with him, and I wanted to know if he had ever encountered any evidence of giants in Peru. And he said, well, I know that there's legends of giants in Peru, but I'm not aware of any historical evidence of giants in Peru. And so we met in a coffee shop, and I interviewed him in this coffee shop, and we went our separate ways after that. Well, the following morning, De La Vega shows up at my hotel. And he walks into the lobby, and he's got a big smile on his face, and he's holding a disc in his hand, a CD. And he hands it to me. And he said, yesterday after our discussion, you got me thinking about this, if there's any historical records of giants. So he said, I went into the digital files of the chronicles that we have access to as historians in Peru. And I did a search. I queried anything related to giants or unusual skeletons, skeletal remains that were discovered during the conquest. And he said, I could not believe how many instances I was able to find related to giants in the historical documentation. He said, here's some of them. He said, this is not even all of them. These are just the ones I was able to find last night. I highlighted them for you in these documents on the CD, the digital files. So I reviewed those files later on, and there were dozens from different chroniclers, from the 1500s to the 1600s, I think even up into the 1700s. Different historical accounts from the archives in Lima of the remains of giants being discovered in Peru. And they were not ambiguous. These are not instances in which the remains of giant sloths or dinosaurs can be confused with giants. So they're not ambiguous. We found a large, femur that we think belonged to an ancient race of giants. It's not that. It's not that at all. It's very specific accounts in which clearly the cadavers, the skeletal remains of gigantic humanoids were discovered. So I have no doubt that during the conquest and as a result of the conquest, the Church of Rome, the Vatican, has accrued not only artifacts related to the antediluvian world, but a lot of knowledge. And because of my experience in Sardinia, and because of some of the things that I was told in Sardinia, I believe that the Vatican is in possession of skeletal remains, in some cases mummified cadavers of giants. And when I say giants, I'm not talking 7 foot tall. I'm talking 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 15 foot tall. I have no doubt, because the conquistadors were finding them in Peru, and in recent history, the residents of Sardinia were finding them all over Sardinia. I interviewed dozens of people in Sardinia who dug up the bones of giants. And we're talking about skeletal remains that were intact with clothing and jewelry, rings on the fingers, necklaces around the necks. And last I've checked, dinosaurs and giant sloths and mammoths didn't wear jewelry. They didn't wear bling. So in some cases, I was told that there were particular priests who were directing the villagers in Sardinia to bring them any remains that they had of giants. And in some of those cases, the remains were burned. In other cases, they were sequestered away. To where? Who knows? While I was in Sardinia, I interviewed 2 individuals, and both of these individuals were hired to excavate in an official capacity in this particular site that had to do with neurologic ruins. And the neurologic culture is a very ancient, mysterious culture that once existed in Sardinia. I think it was a Bronze Age culture. And very mysterious culture, very interesting. But what's even more interesting is that where were they excavating? Of course, beneath the church, or on the premises of the Catholic Church. There was a small cathedral there called the Cathedral of Anastasia in the province of Sadara. And you can go there to this day. And I was in the church of Anastasia, and you can see where the excavations took place on the grounds of the church and beneath the church. And this demonstrates the sort of archaeological treasure, the knowledge that the Catholic Church, just because they occupied these sites, were able to secretly accrue over the centuries. In this case, both of these gentlemen were involved in the excavation and retrieval of not only the bones of giants, but entire skeletons and cadavers of giants, some of which were very well preserved. And these bodies were 8, 9, 10 foot tall. Both of these guys, at different periods of time, they excavated numerous cadavers at the same site. One of them said that, I should continue that thought. And when they would find these body parts or entire skeletal remains of giants or cadavers of giants, the procedure was everything that they found, everything that they were excavating, because they weren't there looking for the bodies of giants. At least that they weren't told that. They were told to excavate the site, to excavate the artifacts. And it wasn't just these two individuals. There was a group of people, and they were working in shifts. And the protocol was any artifacts or skeletal remains that were excavated from the site were to be placed inside of the church. So they're excavating the neuralgic ruins on the grounds of the cathedral and then taking all of the artifacts and placing them in the church. Now, this excavation was being overseen, in part at least, by the University of Cagliari, or a university in Cagliari. And Cagliari is the capital city in Sardinia. Sardinia, of course, is a province of Italy. And I believe there was some oversight also from the Catholic Church. I mean, it was their property. So there's going to be oversight from the Catholic Church. So it must have been some sort of a collaboration between the university at Cagliari and the Catholic Church. Again, this being property of the Catholic Church. So all of these artifacts are going into the church. In fact, there were so many artifacts being excavated, including the bodies and bones of giants. And then after all of these artifacts would be placed into the church during the day, during the excavation, overnight, both of these guys told me this, overnight somebody would come and take them all away. So these guys would return to the excavation site in the morning to the Church of Anastasia, open the doors, and it's empty. Everything was secreted away at nighttime, all of it. They were collecting so many artifacts that they were running out of space in the church. And one of these individuals I interviewed, he decided to go talk to the guy that was in charge of the excavation or overseeing it. And he sat down in his office and he said, we need a bigger space. Is there somewhere else that we can put these artifacts and these humanoid remains that we're finding? Is there somewhere else? I mean, is there another warehouse where we just have too much stuff and we're having to pile stuff up in there and we don't want to ruin the artifacts? And this individual looked at him and he leaned over to him and he said, "Mind your effing business." He said, "This is none of your business. Mind your effing business and go back to work." So he didn't say effing, obviously. He said the F word in Italian. And so this conveyed to the guy who was interviewing that they didn't want them to interfere at all. Just do your job. And they were told, by the way, not to talk about the artifacts that they were excavating. So it was sort of a hostile environment. He told me, this particular individual, again, there were two guys. He told me that one time he was excavating at Anastasia and he uncovered a huge skull and the vertebrae was still attached. So the backbone, the vertebrae was still attached. He said it was so large, his wife was excavating at the site with him on this particular day, that it took him and his wife together to carry it. And he said he was holding the skull like this, right? So it's not like this, it's holding the skull like this. And his wife is walking behind him holding the vertebrae. And they carried the skull and the vertebrae into the Church of Anastasia and laid it on the table. Of course, the next morning, gone. Then he said they were excavating a chamber in a nuraghi, which is those stone towers at the same site at Anastasia. And the tower was sealed from the outside and they had to break into it. And when they broke into the tower, and this kind of contradicts what I was saying earlier, by the way, that the towers weren't necessarily built for giants. They break into the tower, and he said that they discovered that there was a very well-preserved gigantic person, dead, deceased, sitting at a table. And he must have been 9 feet tall, he told me, sitting at a table, and the table was very large, and all of the utensils on the table were overly large. So the cup was really large, the plate was really big, overly big, right? Unusually large. And he said that the oysters that he was eating were still preserved on the dish. Like you could still see the oysters and the shells. And so that room had like been hermetically sealed. And it was preserved. And he said this was like a cadaver. It wasn't like a skeleton. It was like a person who had been deceased for a long time, but preserved like in a coffin. Again, because it must have been buried rapidly, right? And sealed this person in there and killed them, probably suffocated them. And he said it was like 9 or 10 foot tall, he estimated the size. And they a bunch of guys carefully removed this gigantic person, deceased, and laid him in the church. And one time he communicated, one of these individuals, I can't remember which one, communicated to one of the professors who would come and sometimes oversee the excavation from the University of Cagliari. And they told the professor, we're finding some bodies here, and sometimes they're too large to put in the church, right? There's not enough room. There's no table large enough to lay them out on. What do we do with these large bodies? And it was always communicated, we're talking 8, 9, 10 foot tall. That's the size range, 8, 9, 10. And the professor told him, lay the bodies out in the yard at the side of the church. Lay them out, and we'll come and deal with them. So he said, he told me, I remember we laid out 3 bodies in a row, and the next day they were gone. So, I mean, these are the experience of the people in Sardinia. This isn't them accounting some secondhand thing. This is their firsthand experience. And these guys would describe, both of them, the rings that they would find were like that big for fingers, right? Everything was giant-sized. And I talked about, let me walk that back. I was able to interview dozens of people in Sardinia, most of them elderly people, who remembered personally having dug up the bones of giants. And in some cases, they were 12 feet long. And it was known. It was known in Sardinia at the time. We're talking about 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe going back to the 40s. And during that time, Sardinia has always been a very rural, rugged land. And it took a long time to modernize. So it was one of the last places in Italy to get modernized. In other words, the plumbing and the electrical and all of that, the building of roads, it took longer than in other places in Europe and Italy. And when they finally got around to modernizing Sardinia, and they're building roads and digging trenches and digging for foundations of buildings, they were finding a lot of artifacts related to giants. Bones and hands, for example. When I say artifacts, I'm talking about like a hand of a giant sitting there with a ring on it. And this was so common that the people understood that if they were plowing in their fields or digging foundations for their houses or exploring around the Nuraghi Towers, that they might find the bones of giants. And if they did, there was a very strong possibility they would find jewelry on the hands or around the necks. And so they're always looking out for this because obviously this is treasure. They would be able to sell these things. And they would often find them. In one case, I interviewed a man who was, I think he was 101 years old. And I'm trying to remember the region of Sardinia I interviewed him in, and I can't remember his name. It probably will pop in my head as I'm talking here. But I interviewed him, and he was a very jovial fellow and very sharp for being, I think he was 101 years old. I think he was 101. Might have been 100, but I think he was 101 years old. He died not that long after the interview. Very, very sharp, though, for a guy 100 plus years old. And he told me the most extraordinary story. He told me that when he was a young man, he needed money, and so he went and hired himself out to a guy from the village that had a vineyard. And he and a bunch of other guys were out there working in the vineyard, and they were tilling the ground in the vineyard. And as they were tilling the ground, and this was a vineyard that was going to be newly planted, right? So the person in the village had acquired this property, and he was going to till the earth to plant a vineyard. And as these guys, the workforce is out there, including this individual I interviewed, as they're out there tilling the earth, they were starting to uncover bones. And this, by the way, was in the vicinity of a nuragi, of one of these megalithic towers. So the nuragi's here, and the vineyard's next to the nuragi, and there's a dozen guys or so out there tilling the ground in preparation for the plantation of the grapes, and they're starting to dig up the bones of giants. And they're all sort of, they're surprised, and they excavate the bodies. They don't pull them out yet. They just dig them out, and they realize that they had a bunch of bodies of giants, 9 foot long, 9 foot long, and the bodies were all arranged in a crisscross pattern like this. And I think they determined it was north-south. I can't recall. It was either east-west or north-south, but they were all in a crisscross position, all aligned. And there were multiple bodies that were positioned like this. These are the skeletal remains, the cadavers of giants, right? And the owner of the vineyard said, "Stop. This is a problem. I'm going to get in trouble. We have to be careful." And he notified the authorities so that because it's bodies, right? You have to call the coroner. So he notifies the authorities, and he tells them that they're unusually large bodies, right? That they're discovering in his vineyard, and they don't touch them. He doesn't want to get in trouble. I mean, this is like a crime scene or something, right? And what happens is he tells his workers, "Hey, I've just been informed the authorities are coming, and they want everyone to vacate the field. Nobody is allowed to be around here. You guys have to leave. You have to go." So they had to cut their workday short. And this old fellow that I was interviewing, telling me this story, he said, "Well, I really needed the money. And I couldn't afford to just work a half day. I needed to work a full day. So I decided I'm just going to stick around and keep working so that I can go collect a full day's wage at the end of the day." He decided to disregard what the owner of the vineyard, his employer, had said. So he's there working, because he wants to collect his paycheck at the end of the day for a full day's work. And he said suddenly a bunch of vans pulled up. And I think he said something like 3 vans, like big vans or buses or something, pull up, and all these people get out. And he didn't know where they were from, but they looked very official. And he hid himself because they came into the field, and they were measuring the bodies, they were taking pictures of the bodies, and then they were carefully stowing them away into the vehicles, and they were going into the tower. He watched as they went into the Nuragi Tower, and they were inspecting the tower. And he said they removed a part of the tower, and they found a tunnel, and they sealed it up. And he watched all of this operation take place. And then he watched them load up the bodies, and then they left. And he had witnessed the entire thing. And this guy's 100 years old. He has no reason to lie to me about this. He's 100 years old. And he had other experiences besides that, but those were some of the most remarkable ones. He was digging one time. This will connect to what we were talking about earlier. One time he was digging, and again, 100 years old. He's a young man, so this is sometime in the early 20th century. He was digging for the foundation of a house, just as a laborer, right? And he and some guys are digging with shovels, and they hit something hard, and they realized it was this large, I think it was a stone coffin. It had a stone lid on it. And they uncovered it, and they pushed the lid off, the lid of the coffin. And he said there was an enormous body inside, and it was draped in black cloth. So it had been wearing some sort of a black robe or dress, and you could still, the cloth was deteriorated, but it was still there. And the body was, it looked like if you were to open a casket, but it was ancient. And he said it was enormous. It was a gigantic body. And he said inside the coffin, and this was very interesting, he said inside of the coffin, there were coins, Roman coins. And the coins had the inscription and the likeness of Antonius Pius, the Roman emperor. And so you have a body of a giant and coins that date that body to the time of the Roman emperor Antonius Pius. And Antonius Pius was emperor in Rome in the mid-2nd century. So you have coins that date this gigantic body. So does that mean that the Romans knew about the giants? I don't know how large the body was. If the body, he didn't say exactly how large it was. And maybe it was just 7 foot long. Maybe that wasn't that remarkable. It would have been obviously a very large person, especially compared to the Romans, who were somewhat diminutive in stature. But maybe that wouldn't have been considered a giant, like a legendary giant. He didn't tell me how large the body was, but he said it was enormous. But the really interesting part is that he told the local priest about the body. And he told the priest, who was, for whatever reason, was in charge of this construction. Maybe it was, maybe they were building foundations or digging out for foundations of a church or something. I don't recall the details, but the priest told him to break the bodies up and throw them into the foundation. He said, break up those bones and throw them into the foundation. And then he had him give him all of the Roman coins. So break the bodies up, get rid of the bones of this giant person, and give me the coins. That's pretty much how. And he was laughing about it when he told me. So that was very interesting. I heard dozens of stories like this, dozens of stories where people are plowing in their fields and they're uncovering skulls that are this big in Sardinia in the 20th century. And I'm fortunate that I was able to talk to a lot of these elderly people who are surely deceased today, like that gentleman who's 100 years old, but others who were in their 80s, some in their 90s. And it was common knowledge. And if you talk to the younger people, they would say, oh yeah, my grandparents used to tell me that they would find bodies of hands of giants, gigantic fingers with rings on them, or that they knew that those things were being found in Sardinia. Not only do you have the Nuraghi towers, megalithic towers in Sardinia, you also have what are called to this day the tombs of the giants. And the tombs of the giants in Sardinia are megalithic tombs. And they're shaped, I did a film on all this, by the way, when I was working with Steve Quayle at Gen 6 Productions. We produced a film where we feature all these testimonies that I'm telling you. And the film is called Holocaust of Giants, and you can probably still find it somewhere. But at the time, when I was investigating these tombs, I thought that they were shaped in the form of a bull's head. And this is what I say in the film. They're shaped in the form of a bull's head. And indeed, they look like a bull's head. So if you can imagine like a sort of an oval shape followed by like curved horns, right? So it's a shape that sort of looks like a bull's head. But it occurred to me later that they're not shaped like a bull's head. They're shaped like a womb. They're shaped like a womb. And specifically, they're shaped like a uterus with the fallopian tubes. So you can imagine both, like a bull's head, but I think more accurately, a uterus. And why were these tombs shaped like a uterus? Well, the answer is because they were used specifically for a particular rite of passage by the Nuragic people. And the rite of passage is referred to today as the rite of incubation, the rite of incubation. And so you can imagine why they would shape the tomb like a uterus, because there were young people incubating. In other words, it was like a birth was going to happen. It was a rite of passage, like a rebirth, like a new birth. And the purpose of the ritual was that these young people would go into the tomb, because in these tombs, there's a few different kinds of tombs in Sardinia, but what they all have in common is a gallery. They have this internal gallery, and then they have like imagine the shape of the uterus, which looks like the bull's head with the fallopian tubes coming out, and then the gallery is inside of this megalithic tomb. And there's always there's a little doorway. Sometimes there's like a stele, like a large stone with a little doorway cut into it. It's almost like a little doggy door, right? And then sometimes there's a trilithon door. It's actually megalithic stones. And it's a trilithon door, but with a small doorway to where you have to stoop down to get into it. But the stele doorways, like the little doggy doors, are very small so that only very young people could get into them. Like we're talking, teens or preteens. Whatever the coming of age was to the neurologic people, obviously these guys were pretty young. These boys were pretty young, probably in their early teens. And the rite of incubation involved either one or multiple of these young people crawling into the tomb through the opening. And these tombs, in my opinion, at least some of them, were likely mounds. They were likely covered with earth. So it would have looked like a mound. And the young person would crawl into the tomb, and then the tomb would be sealed for a certain amount of time, and that young person would incubate in the tomb. Now, there's probably a couple things going on here. Probably there may be psychedelic substances involved in this. I don't know if that's the case or not. But what I do know is that they're not just in there incubating in a tomb to communicate with their ancestors. They incubate in the tomb to communicate specifically with the mighty ones who are buried beneath the tomb. They're there to communicate with the spirits of dead Nephilim, dead Rephaim, who are buried beneath the tombs, not in the tombs, beneath the tombs. And a lot of archaeologists today will scoff at the notion that the tombs of the giants were built for giants. Well, in one sense, they're correct. The tombs of the giants weren't built to house the bodies of the giants, although they are big enough to do so. I measured them myself. The giants were buried beneath the tombs so that the galleries were built on top, and the young people could go in and incubate with the spirit of the giant. These things were potentially factories for demon possession. That's one way to look at it. You go into the tomb, you get possessed by a spirit of a Nephilim, the spirit of a dead giant, which are the possessing spirits according to the scriptures, and you come out demonized. Or it could be that you're just trying to communicate with your mighty ancestors, the giants, and somehow be imbued with their prowess, their power, their strength and capability in battle, and so forth. But very interesting. The tombs of the giants, megalithic tombs, were built for the rite of incubation, and they're shaped like uteruses. People don't realize that there were more megaliths in Sardinia than any other place in the world that we know of so far. There were over 30,000 megalithic nuraghi towers on the island. 30,000. And of course, the conventional explanation is that these towers served a defensive purpose. In other words, they were built like castles, but there's just way too many of them. 30,000 on one island. And I'm convinced that the towers and the tombs are related. In fact, you can usually find tombs of giants in the vicinity of towers. The towers and the tombs are related, and I think they're both related to communication with the giants, with the Rephaim, with the Nephilim that are buried in the soils of Sardinia. But also the towers clearly have an astronomical purpose. So there's something very interesting, an interesting relationship between the megalithic tombs and the megalithic towers. I believe that this ancient neurologic culture was actually the root culture of the Canaanites and of the Canaanitish peoples that were inhabiting the Levant, the Promised Land, during the conquest by Joshua and the Hebrews. I think that this was a stronghold. Sardinia, the island of Sardinia, was a stronghold of the offspring of the Watchers, of the descendants of the Nephilim in the post-flood world, and that they had migrated to the Levant from Sardinia and probably migrated back to Sardinia after the conquest or during the conquest, some of them at least, of Canaan. But it's clear that the Neuragic civilization, this ancient mysterious civilization, the roots of it are Canaanitish. There's a lot of similarities between the Neuragic culture, the ancient Neuragic culture, and the ancient Canaanites. And it's known that the Phoenicians also inhabited the island of Sardinia, and the Phoenicians were Canaanites. And so it's very possible that the island of Sardinia, that was the origin of the Phoenicians themselves. Because again, the Phoenicians were Canaanites. So it might have been the origin of the Canaanites who migrated to the shores of the Levant a long time ago, and then had established themselves before Joshua entered the Promised Land and drove most of them out. Not all of them, but most of them. The island of Sardinia is a part of Italy. It's located off of the western coast of Rome, and it's below Corsica. So you have mainland Italy here, and then you have Corsica, and then you have Sardinia. And Sardinia has been traditionally a very rugged and difficult place to keep under control. The Romans had a hard time. They used it. They mined Sardinia, but they were mostly occupying the coastal regions. The Sardinian people have always been very difficult to subdue. And I think, the heritage of the Sardinia people, we know today, many of the modern Sardinians are actually related to the Phoenicians. They have Phoenician genetic markers. That's why in Sardinia today, you'll find quite a lot of people with red hair. Red hair is one of the genetic traits of the Sardinians. The secrecy surrounding giants is kind of baffling to me. On one hand, you can understand why conventional archaeologists would keep it secret, because it just blows their theories to pieces. We know that Colonel Powell, for example, who was I believe the first director of the Smithsonian, he knew about the existence of the giants that were being discovered in the mountains of America because he wrote a letter to his friend. And in the letter he said that they cannot yet talk about the giants until they can determine where they came from. And the reason why the origin of the giants was so important to Powell is because Powell was an isolationist. And the Smithsonian Institute the doctrine is isolationist, the doctrine of isolationism. And the doctrine of isolationism propounds that all of these various cultures around the world developed independent of each other. In other words, there was no contact across the seas. Nobody was coming from over the sea. There wasn't cross-pollination from other cultures. In other words, the ancient Egyptians weren't cross-pollinating with anyone in the Americas. Everyone developed totally independent of each other. These are the pillars of modern archaeology and the conventional historical narrative. Isolationism. That's a problem. If you're finding red-haired giants all over the world, obviously these guys are migrating from over the sea. And they're coming from somewhere, and that somewhere happens to be the Middle East. And probably Sardinia as well. Most likely, I think Sardinia is the hub, was the hub of post-flood giants. So Powell didn't want to talk about the giants because it wrecked his theory of isolationism. So there's that, right? But the argument is made sometimes that, well, they don't want to talk about giants because it proves the biblical narrative. Okay, that's a very weak argument, though, because giants don't just prove the biblical narrative, they prove all the myths of all the different ancient cultures around the world. I mean, everybody's got myths of giants, so it's not exclusive to the biblical narrative. The ancient people in general believed in the existence of giants and had legends of giants. Of course, the biblical narrative is a part of that tradition. The attestation of the existence of giants, of course, that's part of the biblical narrative. But it doesn't necessarily prove the biblical narrative. It lends it lends credibility in regard to the accuracy of the biblical narrative. But I don't think that's a very good line of reasoning, that the reason why they're covering up the existence of giants is because it would prove the Bible true. I don't think that's a very good line of reasoning. There's something else going on, especially if the Vatican's involved in the cover-up. Why would the Vatican want to suppress evidence that the biblical narrative is true? Why would they be interested in that? That doesn't make any sense. You'd think that they would be eager to present this evidence to the world and say, see, here's more evidence that the Bible is true, being Christians, right, as they are. So I don't believe that the primary motivation to cover up the existence of giants, of ancient giants, and of perhaps contemporary giants is because they don't want people to believe in the Bible. What is the reason? Why is this topic of giants so taboo? And why has there been what I believe is a historical and systematic cover-up of the existence of giants? Why? Well, the only thing that makes sense to me is that the occult is involved here, that the mystery schools are at the center of this, that the bodies of giants are being used in a very specific way, that there's a purpose, and that they don't want people to know, for whatever reason, they don't want people to know about the existence of these giants because there's something about them that's deeply entrenched, that's deeply intertwined with the mystery schools. I mean, are they using the bodies for ritualistic purposes? Probably. Are they worshiping? Are they venerating these bodies? Probably. Are they harvesting genetic material from them? Probably. That's a much better explanation than, well, they don't want to prove the Bible is true. That, I think, that it's a much more plausible explanation that they're harvesting something from the bodies. They have a use, they have a function, and whatever that use and function is, they don't want anybody to know about it. There's probably a black market that exists for these relics related to giants and other things as well, relics related in general to the antediluvian world, and oddities in general. I mean, out of place artifacts, rather. I know there's a black market for that. So, I suspect it's something to do with the occult. I suspect that the cover-up of giants, the primary reason, has much more to do with the mystery schools than with proving the Bible, proving the veracity of the biblical narrative. And everybody knows that Abraham Lincoln believed, I would say knew, that the bodies of giants were being discovered in the mountains. He references it, that ancient race of giants, I'm paraphrasing, whose remains can still be found in the mountains of America, something along those lines. Abraham Lincoln, that was a definitive statement by Honest Abe. And so I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that the bodies of giants were being discovered in the mountains of America, just like they were being discovered all over Sardinia. I think in some sense, and I illustrate this in the film I made about this, Holocaust of Giants, that in my film Holocaust of Giants, I draw a correlation between Sardinia, the situation that was happening in Sardinia in the 19th and early 20th century, and the situation that was happening in the United States, namely with the Smithsonian cover-up of the remains of giants that were being discovered in the mountains and elsewhere in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I think there's a very interesting correlation there. Both America and Sardinia, for whatever reason, both of these areas were littered with the bones of giants. Sardinia more than America, but I have no doubt that the bodies and bones of giants have been secreted away to the Smithsonian repositories and remain there to this day. We know that in the Podesta emails that were leaked, there was an email in there that was associated with Hillary Clinton, in which she was conveying an interest in the body of Gilgamesh. So I think that's anecdotal, but I think that the occult, members of the occult, and I think that Hillary is a member of the occult, have an interest in the bodies of giants. I think there's something very nefarious happening. I do believe that the late Tom Horn once related to me a very interesting story in which, and he's talked about it publicly as well, but he told me the details of this story while I was staying with him at his house in Crane, Missouri, and he told me that he had obtained images from the invasion of Iraq, specifically from an operation that was happening at the museum in Baghdad, the History Museum in Baghdad. And the images depicted specifically some very large sarcophagi that were being removed from the museum and loaded up into Chinook helicopters. And that after Tom had downloaded these images on his computer, shortly thereafter, his house burned to the ground. And he lost everything, including those images, but he lost everything else. He had a very substantial library that he had lost among all of his personal affects. So it's plausible that part of what we were doing in Iraq, part of the operation was to recover the bodies of giants, the remains of giants that we knew were being kept in the museum in Baghdad. And I think we did go and recover. I have no reason to doubt Tom's story. I think we did recover those bodies. Is it possible, and I'm just thinking out loud here, is it possible that you can utilize the cadavers of giants to summon the spirits of the giants, i.e., the demons? We're talking about the disembodied spirits of the giants that are wandering the earth as disembodied vagabonds, the possessing spirits. Is this the interest that the occult has in these bodies? Is this why they want the remains of giants? Can you somehow use these remains in an occult ritual and occult practices to summon or control, or even use them to as a mechanism through which you can become possessed, or other people can become possessed with the spirits of these deceased giants? I mean, maybe that's the interest here. Maybe that's why no one is allowed to talk about the giants. So I recently returned from an expedition in Peru. Part of the reason why I went down there was because I was invited by Professor Roger Zuniga from the University of Ica to come and examine the so-called tridactyl beings, these three-fingered mummies that are in the possession of the university. And I accepted the invitation, and I traveled to Ica. Ica is in the desert. It's kind of between Paracas and Nazca, the Palpa area. And it's an extreme desert. I mean, it looks like the surface of Mars. It's a very interesting environment. And because it's so dry, it's one of the driest places in the world, you have extraordinarily well-preserved mummies and desiccated bodies. And it's really desiccated bodies more than mummies. So this is where you find in the Paracas, Ica, Palpa region of Peru, this is where you find a lot of the mummies, the Paracas mummies and the Nazca mummies. And the Paracas mummies, when you find Paracas mummies, desiccated bodies is the correct term, because a mummy is wrapped and preserved in a different way. A desiccated body is, the flesh is just dried. It's almost like you dehydrate the body. But it's much easier to refer to them as mummies than desiccated bodies. So if I say mummy, just understand these are not technically mummies. But these desiccated bodies are preserved so well. So if you find mummies related to the Nazca or Paracas culture, oftentimes you're going to find them in the fetal position, and they're going to be wrapped in burial bundles. They're going to be encased in burial bundles. And burial bundles are multiple layers of fabric. And inside the fabric is this mummy in the fetal position. And grave robbers often look for these burial bundles because it's the nobility that's buried in this fashion. And the nobility, of course, is sometimes associated with all kinds of artifacts, including gold and silver and other artifacts that can be sold on the black market. So you have grave robbers, huaqueros, they're called in Peru, who are always out there in the desert looking for these desiccated remains. And it happened that some years ago, there's the origins of the tridactyl beings, the three-fingered mummies, are convoluted. I've heard several different stories. But one of the stories is that years ago, maybe 7, 8 years ago, maybe 10 by now, some grave robbers discovered a cavern or a cave or a tunnel in which 150 three-fingered mummies had been buried. And these huaqueros extracted some of these mummies and they sold them to various individuals. Ultimately, the University of Ica was able to acquire 4. And they're not all the same. Some of these three-fingered mummies are very small. They're like 1 to 2 feet tall. Some of them are quite large, and they're in the fetal position, just like the Paracas desiccated bodies or the Nazca desiccated bodies. They're in that fetal position, and they were discovered in mummy bundles, I was told by some of the professors at the university. Although, remember, the origins are convoluted. I've heard other stories, and I think I've heard the real story, which probably won't publicize just yet. But understand that many of these things were discovered. Some are small, some are large. They look different. The similarity is that they have 3 fingers. The small ones and the large ones look different. And so when I went to the university in Ica, I examined these mummies, and I approached the large one first, and it was in a case. It was in a glass case. And I was immediately struck with the sensation, let's say, that this thing was living and breathing at some time in the past. Now, I don't have any scientific reason to believe that that was in fact the case. It was just my initial reaction when I walked up to this mummy. And you have to understand, I have a firewall up. When it pertains to Central and South America, let's say this again. When it pertains to artifacts from Central and South America, I have a firewall up because there's a lot of fake stuff circulating. There's a lot of fake artifacts. I've been exposed to a lot of fake artifacts. I understand the way the markets work, and a lot of gringos are buying these artifacts thinking they're real. It's a whole industry, and there's a lot of money to be made. So, and it's rampant in Central and South America, especially artifacts related to aliens, alien artifacts. I've got a firewall. Most of that stuff is fake. And so I'm very incredulous, and I refrained from commenting on these tridactyl desiccated bodies, these 3-fingered mummies, for a very long time because I didn't really want to comment on them until I had the opportunity to examine them up close in person. But like I said, when I walked up to the larger body, which is called Maria, which the university has, Maria/Mario, they call it now, my first impression was, I think this is real. I think this was a living, breathing entity. Now, at the university, they have Maria, which is the larger mummy, and then they have the smaller ones. The ones that were featured by Jaime Maussan, the Mexican ufologist Jaime Maussan, a couple of years ago or a year ago. He had this press briefing, which went viral on the internet because he unveiled. There were members of the Mexican Congress there. He unveiled the alien bodies there, right? The little ones that are 2 feet tall. They have 3 fingers. And the university had 2 of those. And I did not get the same impression from the small ones as I did from the large one. The anatomy of the larger mummy, and I call it a larger mummy because although it's in the fetal position, if that thing were to stand up, it would be typical stature of the natives in Peru. Probably 5'6", somewhere around 5'6", 5'7", maybe. You have to understand that, because it's dried out, it's shrunk. The anatomy of Maria, the larger mummy, looks functional to me. There's no red flags, at least my initial observations, where this looks like functional anatomy to me. Even the way that the 3-fingered hands and the 3-fingered toes, and these are very long fingers. Even the way that the bones connect to the wrists and to the ankles. It seems very natural, that the anatomical flow seems very functional to me. Whereas the smaller ones, they seem very rigid, and I don't get the same feeling. The anatomy seems off. Now, I'm not a professional. I don't work with human anatomy. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a forensic scientist. These are just my, as a layperson, my initial observations. But the small ones, they just don't look like they have functional anatomy. They don't look like they were living and breathing at some time. They look very rigid, and the joints they just look off to me. I can't imagine those things having flesh on them and walking around and actually functioning as living beings. One of them is in a seated position. It's missing its head. It's in the seated position. Again, it's very rigid. They're very rigid, the little ones. So understand that these are distinct from the larger ones. Their facial structure is totally different. The small desiccated bodies have a flat face, and they look like the aliens from the Steven Spielberg movie. I can't recall the title of it, but they look exactly like that, and just unrealistic as far as I'm concerned. But let's return to the larger mummy, Maria. Maria has some anatomical oddities that are highly intriguing to me. For example, she has an elongated skull. And I've done an extensive investigation into the elongated skulls of Paracas. And most people are familiar with those. They're all over the internet. I've held them. I've analyzed them. We even did a genetic analysis from one of the skulls, which yielded some very surprising results. We were able to get mitochondrial DNA from one of those Paracas elongated skulls, and the DNA indicates haplogroup M, which is interesting because haplogroup M has a wide distribution in Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and other places, but no distribution in the Americas. It is not represented at all in the Americas. It's like one of the only places where you don't find haplogroup M is precisely the haplogroup of this elongated skull, which indicates that these people migrated from over the sea. They came from somewhere else to the shores of Peru, at least members of the Paracas culture, or there was a culture that migrated and interbred with a native culture, and that resulted in the Paracas culture. Of course, Elie Marsuli did a phenomenal analysis, a much more extensive analysis of the elongated skulls in regard to the genetics. They did a genetic analysis with Mondo Gonzalez was involved in that, Chase Koletsky and others, and that was led by my colleague Elie Marsuli. And they also were able to determine that the haplogroups of the Procus elongated skulls, the haplogroups were not, some of the haplogroups did indicate indigenous populations in South America, but many of the haplogroups indicated Middle East, Europe, Central Asia, and so forth. So that just reinforces the idea that there was a migration and an interbreeding. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because it's going to be relevant to these, in my opinion, we're going to have some relevance here to the tridactyl beings. The tridactyls have the elongated skulls, just like the Procus culture, just like that. And there are several of these larger tridactyls. I think there's 7, 8, maybe up to a dozen of them that are known, and many more that are unknown. And some of them have more accentuated elongated skulls. Maria's skull is slightly elongated, but it is elongated. So that's an oddity. But the most striking anomaly, anatomical anomaly, are her overly large orbital sockets, like really, really large eyes. And she has these eyelids that are divided in the middle. And so she has these large eyelids with clearly very large eyelids, very large eyes, and very, very small nose. And something that a lot of people don't realize about at least Maria, if not all of these larger specimens, is they have puckered lips. And the way that the professors explained it to me was that their lips are puckered in the way that chimpanzee lips are puckered, or gorilla lips. So this is a freakish being. Okay, assuming that this thing was alive and breathing sometime in the distant past, you would have had this elongated skull, and by the way, they don't have ears. Elongated skull, no ears, gigantic eyes, barely a nose, and puckered lips. That's what these things would have looked like. And obviously, most bizarrely of all, these 3 fingers and 3 toes, very long 3 fingers and 3 toes. Very strange indeed. But as I said, the anatomy of these large mummies seems to flow very naturally. They do not look like they're composites. In fact, the reason why I'm even interested in these mummies is because there has been extensive scientific analysis. They've been subjected to extensive scientific analysis. And the data has been published freely online. Nobody's hiding the results. And there have been several scientific teams that have come to investigate these mummies, the small ones and the large ones. There was an American team that was associated with Jaime Maussan who came, and they were led by John McDowell, a celebrated forensic investigator. And they did MRI scans, X-ray, DNA analysis. I don't know the extent of all of the testing that McDowell's team did, but the combination of all of these different teams that have analyzed the mummies have accrued all of this kind of data. Again, MRI, X-ray, DNA analysis, and other tests and other analyses besides. And universally, if you read the data and you listen to the opinion of the scientists who have examined these mummies, they all say the same thing. Now, before I say what they say, understand that McDowell, he was not given access to the small ones. He only analyzed the large ones. And what they say, so let's be specific to the large mummies. The universal conclusion about the large mummies is that they're not fake. In other words, and when they say they're not fake, what they mean is that there's nothing in the anatomy of these mummies that doesn't belong. There's no epoxy, there's no plastic, there's no, like metal wiring. There's nothing there that doesn't belong. All that's there is tissue and bone. Sinew and bone. That's it. And skin. So there's nothing out of place in the anatomy. Furthermore, they all attest to the fact that the anatomy is natural. It seems to be natural. The way that the the wrists, and the way that the hands connect to the wrists, as I said, which was my initial observation as a layperson, the way that the feet connect to the ankles, it has a natural anatomical flow. The scientists, especially the American scientists, are not willing to say these things were alive and breathing, but they are willing to say they're not fake, and they suspect that they might have been alive and breathing at one time based on the anatomy. And that's what I'm willing to say at this point. I suspect that the large ones might very well have been alive and breathing. They might have been sucking air on planet Earth at some point in the distant past, walking around. They've been carbon dated to between 1,000 and I think 1,500 years ago. I think that's the time frame that these various mummies fall in, somewhere 1,200 years more or less ago, which puts them squarely in the time frame of the Procus culture. I find that to be very intriguing. So I analyzed these mummies. I didn't do any sort of scientific testing. I mean, what can I do that hasn't been done already? And then I interviewed Dr. Zuniga, and all of this is going to be published on my YouTube channel. So if you want to see the full debrief of this with all of the data, you can go over to my YouTube channel. I'm going to be publishing a video on this. And one of the most interesting things that Dr. Zuniga told me was that the DNA analysis across the board was indicating 30% human DNA, 70% anomalous. And Zuniga highlighted the fact that human beings have more, genetically speaking, have more in common with a papaya than with these tridactyl beings. We share about 40% of our DNA with a papaya, according to Dr. Zuniga. So that's very interesting. And when we talk about anomalous DNA, we're talking about DNA that does not conform to any known creature on planet Earth. It's anomalous. It's unknown. Zuniga and his colleagues at the University of Ica are unequivocally convinced that these mummies are real, in the sense that they were living and breathing, including the small ones. Now, again, my initial observation is I'm persuaded at this point, based on my initial observation of these desiccated bodies, that although I do believe the large ones very well could have been living, breathing beings, I am not persuaded that the small ones were living, breathing beings. I think, and I always reserve the right to change my mind, it's just my sense. And again, this isn't based on the data, because the professors in Peru will tell you that the data indicates that they're all real in that sense. They were all living at some point in the distant past, about 1,200 years ago. But my sense is that these smaller mummies are effigies of the larger ones, and that they were buried with the larger ones for some sort of ritualistic purpose. So they're like, you can think of them maybe as ancient dolls. They're effigies, they're facsimiles of the larger ones. And if that's the case, then they're composites of different kinds of animals, replicas of the larger ones. That's just as I keep saying, that's just my impression. Now, when I came home from Peru, I pulled up some interviews by Dr. McDowell, and I was very interested to discover that's his opinion as well. He is leaning in the direction, based on interviews I listened to him. Of him. He seems to be persuaded also that although he thinks there's a very strong possibility the large ones are real in the sense that they were living beings, the small ones appear to be dolls or effigies. So they drew this. At least the guys from the American team drew the same conclusion. Now, it's possible that the small ones are real in that sense as well, that they were also living. It's very possible. Again, Zuniga and his colleagues are totally convinced that they're all real. All 150 of them are real. And I asked him to describe some of the anatomical anomalies of both the large specimens and the small ones. And he rattled off, he began to rattle off just a very impressive list of oddities. And the beings are humanoid, generally speaking. They're humanoid, they're bipedal. But a lot of the bones and the positions of the bones and the musculature and the skin is totally divergent. It's totally different than the human species. The skin, he was telling me, is much more reptilian than human. It seems to be textured like a lizard, basically. The configuration of the rib cage, the configuration of the neck, and some of the other skeletal structure of the anatomy is quite different than ours. So it's not just that they're a little different than us. They're as he said, they're only at most 30% similar to us genetically speaking, and somewhat similar to us anatomically speaking. They're bipedal. It's been discovered that some of the specimens have eggs, literally eggs, like a reptile. And the contents of the eggs have been tested, and all of that is online, and it appears to be organic. One of the most compelling aspects of these mummies is that some of them have metallic implants. Some of the smaller mummies have metallic implants in the chest. One of the larger mummies, at least one of the larger mummies, has a metallic implant right in the center of its forehead. And these implants are made of gold, and at least one of them has a very rare alloy. It's called osmium. And osmium is relatively new in regard to our understanding of osmium, and it has a very limited use. Its utility is very limited, at least in the modern world. And we only use it, as far as I know, in communication devices. And I'm pretty sure, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't know that osmium has ever been discovered in any other ancient artifact. But it's one of the alloys in these metal implants, or at least in some of them. So what's that doing there? That's very bizarre. And something about these implants that, again, I find very compelling is that Dr. Zuniga described to me how the bone and the sinew have clearly grown over the implants, which indicates that they were implanted while this thing was alive, resulting in the bone. That's the only way that the bone would grow over the implants. So that I find that very compelling. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I was impressed by how knowledgeable and honest and sincere Dr. Zuniga was. And he wasn't aggressively trying to convince me that these things were real. He's really just fascinated by them. I mean, that's what he conveyed to me. He was genuinely fascinated, awestruck by these tridactyl beings. And he told me that he is persuaded by the data. He can't argue with the data. And because I pressed him on this, I said, do you really think the little ones are real? I mean, their anatomy is so bizarre. It doesn't seem functional to me. What do I know? But as a casual observer, the anatomy of the little ones doesn't seem functional to me. And he said, I know, but all of the data indicates that they're real. And I can't argue with the data. That's what he told me. He said, I have to acquiesce to the data. So I asked him, what the response of the Ministry of Culture in Peru has been. And initially it was very hostile. The Ministry of Culture was convinced that these were fakes, hoaxes, and there was an incident in which 3 of the smaller desiccated bodies were confiscated in the airport. And what I've been told, and I believe this is a proven fact at this point, is that the bodies that were confiscated, at first the press made a big deal about this in Peru and said somebody was trying to smuggle out these artifacts from Peru and they were found to be hoaxes. And that disproves all of the rest of the 150 mummies. See, they're hoaxes. I mean, and they were clearly not real. I mean, they were hoaxes. They were composites of different creatures, and I think there was epoxy in them. And but it later was proven, as far as I know, this is what I was told in Peru, that those, and in fact, the person who was in possession of these artifacts admitted that they were facsimiles. In other words, they were models based on the actual mummies. And so the conspiracy theory is that the Ministry of Culture orchestrated this confiscation at the airport to disprove the authenticity of the mummies. Case closed. See, we dissected them. They're fake. They're all fake, right? That somebody wanted to disprove the authenticity of the other mummies. So it seems to me that there's some credibility to that story. I was told by the professors in Peru that had happened. So if in fact the confiscation of these fake alien mummies, 3-fingered mummies, was orchestrated by the Ministry of Culture or somebody else, then that lends credibility to the authenticity of the mummies, of the real ones. So these are my initial thoughts. I reserve the right to change my mind. I am convinced that the larger mummies, Maria and her like, were alive at some point in the distant past, namely circa 1,200 years ago. And I do believe that they are related to the Paracas elongated skulls. My hypothesis is that assuming that these tridactyl beings were alive and breathing during the time when the Paracas culture was flourishing in Peru, that they were interbreeding with the Paracas culture, with members, individuals from the Paracas culture, and that resulted in the Paracas nobility with the elongated skulls. Now understand that many, perhaps most of the elongated skulls in Paracas, the Paracas elongated skulls, are in fact the result of cranial deformation. Let me say that again. They are the result of cradle headboarding and head binding. Artificial cranial deformation is the correct explanation for the majority of the elongated skulls. However, I am persuaded that the noble class, that the elongation of their skulls, which is much more accentuated, they have much larger craniums, is the result of a genetic variation. It's a genetic anomaly. In other words, it's natural. I'm convinced that fetuses, I've seen evidence that fetuses have been discovered with elongated skulls. And if that's true, it's case closed, because you can't cradle headboard a fetus in the womb. So if you have fetuses or really, really young newborn babies with elongated skulls, then you're looking at the product of a genetic variation. So, again, assuming that the tridactyls were real, and assuming that some of the elongated skulls, namely of the Paracas nobility, are the result of a genetic alteration, then it seems reasonable to me to infer that there was interbreeding. And that the product, the hybrid offspring of the tridactyl beings, and the Paracas people would be a noble class among the Paracas with naturally elongated skulls and perhaps some other anatomical anomalies, oddities. That's rank speculation, just conjecture. But if the tridactyls are real, then I think it's perfectly plausible. And I talked to Zúñiga about this, and he had never really considered that. He was only vaguely familiar with the elongated skulls, the Paracas elongated skulls, which I was a little bit surprised by that, seeing as he's a professor at the University of Ica. But he conceded that it's possible. It's possible that if they were living contemporaneously, and they were, that they might have been interbreeding. So what you're talking about here is a crypto-terrestrial species that is inhabiting the earth, concurrent with the Paracas culture, to their contemporaries, and is clearly interacting with the Paracas culture or the Nazca culture, because they're being buried in the fetal position, intentionally buried, and in some cases in the burial bundles. This indicates that they were alive, they died, and either the Paracas or the Nazca culture buried them in the manner of the Paracas and Nazca cultures, which means they were interacting with them. So the question is, what in the world are they, and where do they come from? I suspect, assuming again that they're real, I suspect that they're subterranean. There is some indication that they could be aquatic, but I suspect they're subterranean. And if they were alive 1,200 years ago, could they still be alive today? Are there still specimens of this non-human species alive today? Now, people are speculating all over the internet, and have been for the last 7 years, that these are aliens, that these are extraterrestrials. They could be. That's possible, but it's just as possible that they're crypto-terrestrial. In other words, crypto-terrestrial means that they are cryptically inhabiting the earth, that they're native to the earth and they're just hidden. They're concealed. Their existence is concealed from us. In other words, they're living inside of the earth, in the bowels of the earth, and caverns and tunnels and whatever, underground cities maybe, or maybe they're living under the oceans. Who knows? I mean, the speculation is endless here. But I do want to make it clear that it is still possible that they're hoaxes. I think it's very unlikely, because if they're hoaxes, this constitutes the greatest hoax in the history of archaeology. This is certainly the most complicated, the most complex hoax ever perpetrated, if in fact these mummies are hoaxes. I mean, the level of detail that went into them is unprecedented. And remember, there's hundreds of them. So to me, it's unlikely that they're hoaxes. So that's one possibility, that they're hoaxes. And when I say hoax, what that means is they were purposely created to be sold or to be marketed to the world as if they're real and with a financial incentive. That's a hoax. It's also possible that they're real artifacts, but they weren't real beings. What do I mean by that? It's possible that an ancient culture, such as the Paracas or Nazca, created these composite beings and buried them for some ritualistic purpose. That, in other words, the mummies are real in regard to the parts involved in the composite, right? But they weren't living, breathing beings. That's another possibility. I find that possibility to be more likely than the hoax, but in order for that to be true, you have to attribute a lot of skill to the Paracas or Nazca people in creating these mummies. I mean, this wasn't a hack job. They're very intricately, the joints and all of the various anatomical constituents are very, very precisely fitted together so that they look natural. I mean, how are ancient people accomplishing that? So that one also seems unlikely. So the hoax and the ancient artifact theory both seem less likely than these things were actually living creatures. that seems to be the simplest explanation here, at least as it pertains to the larger mummies. I'm not willing to go there with the smaller mummies. So it could turn out that the smaller mummies, as I keep saying, are just as authentic as the larger ones. It could turn out that they're all hoaxes. I'm just conveying my initial observations here. It's hard to argue with the data. It really is hard to argue with that much data. That is freely available online. I mean, it's published online. The CT scans, the X-rays, the genetic analysis, it's all public knowledge at this point. It's all available to the public. So nobody's attempting to hide any of the data. And that's compelling. And it's because of the data that all of the professors I talked to in Enoch are persuaded that they're totally authentic, totally real. And I was told that the Ministry of Culture is slowly coming around, slowly warming to the idea that these are in fact real. That these mummies were real, living, breathing creatures, precisely because the data is accumulating. And at some point, it's going to become undeniable. It's just a tsunami of data, and which doesn't mean that they're not hoaxes. I just want to put that out there. It doesn't mean they're not hoaxes. It just means it's becoming more and more. It's becoming less and less likely that these are hoaxes as the data accumulates. And what I'm conveying here, I think, is the general consensus of most of the scientists who've looked at these things. I don't think anybody yet is willing to jump out and say, these were living, breathing beings, and we need to accept them as such. But as time goes by and more data is collected, everyone's kind of moving in that direction, quietly and inevitably moving in that direction. And let's just be clear. I mean, if that's the case, this is the most important discovery in human history, archaeological discovery in human history. Nothing even comes close. We're talking about a non-human species that was living contemporaneously with the Nazca Paracas people, and that were buried in the manner of those cultures, which means they were interacting with them. That demands a rewriting of history, at least in this part of the world. And if these creatures were living and breathing in Paracas 1,200 years ago, then who's to say they weren't living and breathing in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia? Or aren't still living and breathing under the ice in Antarctica, or something like that. I mean, all bets are off. We don't really know, and anything's possible at that point. Could they be extraterrestrials? Certainly they could be. I mean, they could be anything. Cryptoterrestrial, extraterrestrial, if they are real. There's an interesting connection between the discovery of these tridactyl mummies and something I discovered in Peru in 2019. We were in Peru working on a film project, myself, my partner Gary Haven, and our crew. And at the time, we were driving into the desert of Pisco, which is, you have the desert of Pisco, Paracas, and Ica, the Palpa area. It's generally the same area. I mean, it's the same sort of terrain. And we were driving from the city of Pisco to this lake called Lake Morón. And at the time, we were looking for treasure. We were filming a treasure hunt, and we were looking for Inca treasure in the lake. And our route to and from the lake, we would pass an archaeological site called the Chongos necropolis. And the Chongos necropolis, it's not like it's not a roped off archaeological site. It's totally open, and it's the main feature of the site is an adobe pyramid, a large adobe pyramid, and it's in ruins, but it's an adobe pyramid. It's pretty impressive. And I remember we were driving to the lake, and I'm looking at the pyramid, and I had this intuition that there was something beneath it. And specifically, it was very specific. The intuition was that there was a tunnel beneath the pyramid. And I told my team, there's a tunnel beneath that pyramid. We need to take our GPR unit out there and drone the pyramid. We did. Our GPR team went out there. They flew the drone around the pyramid, and we discovered not one, but two massive artificial tunnels 100 feet beneath the Chongos pyramid. These tunnels are so large you could drive a semi-truck through them. And all of this is featured in a film series that's available in my community. If anybody wants to watch this, see the data, see us drone the site, and see what we discovered, you can go over to my members community. And if you're an annual subscriber, you get access to those films. And we have the 3D renderings of the tunnels through our GPR technology. And I mean, they're huge. And we have no idea how far they go. But they're there. There's two massive tunnels, and they're sort of crisscrossing beneath the pyramid. And understand that the Chongos necropolis, archaeologists believe that that was the center of the Procus culture. So this was built by the Procus people. And all around the Chongos necropolis, you can find elongated skulls sticking out of the sand, sticking out of the desert floor, or fragments of elongated skulls with red hair. That's one of the features of the Procus people, that they had red hair. And you find burial bundles or fragments of burial bundles all over the place, and just shards of bones just laying everywhere. It's a necropolis. It's basically a graveyard. And we detected a bunch of burial bundles, by the way, around the necropolis during our scan. We could see the burial bundles, and we could see the mummies inside of them in the fetal position. And so this is the Procus culture. And I learned later on from a particular source, this individual likely is the guy who discovered the mummies, not the Waquero, not the grave digger, but this other guy that I've been interfacing with. He told me that in reality, the mummies were not discovered in a cavern or in a cave. They were discovered in a very large tunnel, deep underground. And I told him about what we had discovered at Chongos, and he was intrigued, to say the least. And after communicating with him for a while, by the way, he has specimens in his own collection. He has specimens himself that he's been analyzing because he discovered them or was involved in the discovery of these mummies. He's not told anybody where he's actually discovered them. He's put out misinformation so that nobody could go back and screw with the site, especially grave robbers or the Ministry of Culture. He's kept it hidden. So he's purposely seeded misinformation. This is what he told me. And he also told me that I explained to him, I expressed to him what my initial thoughts about these mummies and my hypothesis that this tridactyl species was interbreeding with the Procus people. And he was astounded because that is precisely what he believes. And furthermore, he believes that they're subterranean and that they're still alive. And he and I discussed a joint expedition into the desert to go down into the tunnels and thoroughly explore them. So that's something that let me rephrase that. I got to be careful. Let's just leave it there. So I find that very interesting. I think that I know that the tunnels exist. I detected them with my equipment. And if in fact these beings were discovered in one of these tunnels go somewhere. Where do they go? Maybe they just connect, the important cities, the Procus and Nazca people, or maybe they go to some kind of underground city. Maybe they connect to the Chinkana. And in fact, the legends in Peru regarding the Chinkana, the legends of the Quechua and the Aymara people regarding the Chinkana, is that there is a race of non-human beings inhabiting it. So it's not beyond the pale to wonder if these things are still alive and if there's some sort of underground city beneath the Andes.